I didn't fight when my son told me it was time. He said it softly, like someone trying to do the right thing, like someone carrying a heavy burden he didn't ask for. He avoided eye contact when he spoke, kept his hands busy with his car keys, and smiled in that forced way people do when they've already made a decision for you. I looked around my own living room, the same place I had built from nothing, the same walls that held every memory of my life, and I realized something in that moment. I was no longer part of his plans. He said the nursing home would be better for me, safer, that I would have care, people around me, professionals who knew what they were doing. He said it like a solution, not like an ending. And I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, or the years I worked just to keep a roof over his head. I simply nodded and packed my things. Because sometimes, when the betrayal comes from your own blood, silence is the only dignity you have left. The place he chose was not cheap. I knew that the moment we arrived. The floors were polished, the air smelled clean, too clean, and the staff greeted him with a familiarity that didn't feel new. That was the first thing that stayed with me. They knew his name before he even introduced himself. They looked at him with a kind of understanding that went beyond a first visit, beyond paperwork and signatures. And yet, he acted like everything was happening for the first time. I was given a room with a window facing a quiet garden. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like a place designed for people who were meant to disappear quietly. My son didn't stay long. He helped me place my suitcase by the bed, adjusted the curtain like he was fixing something small, and then he said he would visit soon. That word people use when they don't want to commit to a date, when they don't want to promise anything real. Days passed, and soon never came. But what troubled me wasn't his absence. It was the feeling that something about all of this had already been arranged long before I ever stepped into that building. And then, one afternoon, everything changed. Because the police called me. The first time I realized something wasn't right wasn't because of anything obvious, but because of something subtle, something almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. It was the way the nurse looked at me when she handed me my medication that morning, holding the small plastic cup just a second longer than necessary. Her eyes scanning my face as if she expected a reaction I didn't give. I noticed the hesitation in her voice when she said my name, like she was unsure whether to treat me as just another resident or as someone who already knew more than she should. And when I asked her calmly who was responsible for covering the cost of my stay, she smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Your family has everything taken care of," before quickly turning away, as if that answer had been rehearsed, as if she had been told not to say anything beyond that. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected, echoing in my mind throughout the day as I sat by the window watching the garden outside, where other residents moved slowly, some in wheelchairs, others guided by caregivers who spoke in soft, careful tones, as if everyone there was already halfway gone. I began to think about my son again, about how quickly everything had happened, how he had insisted that this was the best option, how he had avoided discussing details whenever I tried to ask questions, brushing them aside with phrases like, "Don't worry about it," and "I've handled everything." But the more I replayed those conversations in my mind, the more I realized something uncomfortable. He had never actually explained anything. Not the cost, not the paperwork, not the process. Just urgency. Just pressure. Just a quiet insistence that I should trust him, without asking why. Later that afternoon, I decided to walk down the hallway slowly, observing more than moving, letting my eyes catch the small details most people ignore. The office doors that remained closed, the whispers between staff members that stopped the moment I passed by, the way one of the administrators glanced at me and then immediately looked down at her clipboard, as if avoiding eye contact on purpose. I stopped near the reception desk, pretending to adjust my cardigan while listening carefully, and I heard just enough to make my chest tighten, a fragment of a sentence, barely audible, one employee whispering to another, "She still doesn't know, right?" Followed by a quick silence, the kind that only happens when someone realizes they're being overheard. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not panic, not fear. Something colder, something sharper. I returned to my room without saying a word, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my suitcase, at the few belongings I had brought with me, and I felt it clearly for the first time. This wasn't just about being placed in a nursing home. This wasn't just about my son making a decision without me. There was something else happening beneath the surface, something planned, something hidden. And whatever it was, it involved me more than anyone there wanted me to understand. And for the first time since I arrived, I stopped accepting things in silence and started paying attention. That night, sleep didn't come easily, not because of the unfamiliar bed or the quiet hum of the building settling into silence, but because my mind refused to let go of the fragments I had collected throughout the day, each one small on its own, but together forming something I could no longer ignore. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the nurse's hesitation, the whispered conversation near the reception desk, the way my son had rushed everything without ever truly explaining anything, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this situation hadn't been decided in a moment of concern or care, but had been arranged carefully, step by step, long before I ever realized what was happening. It wasn't impulsive. It was intentional. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, before most of the residents had left their rooms, and I decided to move quietly, without drawing attention, allowing myself to observe rather than participate, to listen more than speak. As I walked slowly past the administrative office, I noticed the door slightly open, just enough to reveal a desk covered in files, folders stacked in a way that suggested ongoing cases rather than routine paperwork, and for a brief moment, I considered stepping closer, just to take a better look, but something stopped me. Not fear, but instinct, the kind that tells you when to wait instead of acting too soon. So I kept walking, pretending not to notice, even though every part of me wanted to turn back. Later, during breakfast, I sat alone as I had been doing since I arrived, but this time I paid attention to the conversations around me. Not the words themselves, but the tone, the patterns, the things people avoided saying directly. One woman mentioned her daughter visiting every weekend, another spoke about her grandson bringing her flowers, and as I listened, I realized how different my situation was. Not because my son hadn't visited yet, but because no one had asked about him. Not a single staff member had checked in, not a single casual question like, "Has your family been in touch?" Or, "Do you have visitors coming soon?" It was as if they already knew the answer. As if they already knew he wasn't coming back. That realization settled heavily inside me, but I didn't react, not outwardly. Instead, I finished my meal slowly, returned my tray, and walked back toward my room, maintaining the same calm expression I had carried since the beginning, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that reacting too soon would only close doors I hadn't even found yet. Whatever was happening here, whatever my son had set in motion, it depended on me remaining unaware, passive, compliant. And the moment I broke that expectation, everything could change. And then, just as I reached my door, I heard my name being called from behind me. Not by a nurse, not by a caregiver, but by a voice I hadn't heard since the day I arrived, firm, official, and impossible to ignore. It was the receptionist. And she was holding the phone. "The police are asking for you." For a brief moment I didn't move, not because I hadn't heard her, but because my mind needed time to process what those words actually meant, to separate imagination from reality, to understand why the police, of all people, would be asking for me in a place where I had only just arrived and barely spoken to anyone. I turned slowly, keeping my expression neutral, controlled, as if this were just another routine interruption. But inside, something had shifted again, something deeper than curiosity, something closer to certainty. Whatever had been hidden from me until now was no longer going to stay hidden. I walked toward the reception desk without rushing, aware of the eyes following me, the subtle pause in conversations around the room, the way even the staff seemed slightly more attentive than usual, as if this moment mattered more than they wanted to admit. The receptionist handed me the phone with both hands, a gesture that felt unnecessarily formal, and when I took it, I noticed the slight tension in her fingers before she let go, like she was reluctant to be part of whatever was about to happen. I brought the receiver to my ear, steady, composed, and said nothing at first, allowing the voice on the other end to speak before I revealed anything about myself. "Mrs. Evelyn?" the man asked, his tone calm but direct, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. I confirmed quietly, and there was a brief pause, not hesitation, but intention, like he was choosing his next sentence carefully. "This is Detective Harris. I'm calling regarding a financial matter connected to your name." Financial. That word landed differently than anything else I had heard since arriving there. Not medical, not legal in a general sense, financial. Something precise. Something traceable. Something that could be proven. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't ask questions yet. I simply listened because I had learned over the years that people reveal more when you give them space to continue. He explained that there had been unusual activity involving accounts linked to me, movements that didn't match my history, transactions that had raised internal alerts before being flagged for further investigation. As he spoke, I felt a strange clarity settling over me. Not confusion, not shock, but recognition. The kind that comes when something you couldn't explain suddenly begins to take shape. The expensive facility. The urgency. The silence. The lack of explanation. It was all connected. "Have you authorized anyone to act on your behalf recently?" he asked. That was the moment everything aligned. Because I hadn't. And yet, someone clearly had. For a few seconds after the detective's question, I allowed silence to exist between us, not because I didn't understand what he was asking, but because I understood it too well, and I knew that the way I responded would determine everything that came next. My grip on the phone remained steady, my voice calm when I finally spoke, but inside, something had already hardened, something that no longer allowed doubt to soften the reality forming in front of me. "No," I said slowly, clearly, without hesitation. "I have not authorized anyone to act on my behalf." There was a pause on the other end, not of surprise, but of confirmation, as if my answer had just closed a loop they had already suspected was open. And in that silence, I realized something that made my chest tighten. Not only had something been done in my name, but it had been done with enough confidence that whoever did it believed I would never question it. The detective continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more precise, more careful with each word, as if he was now speaking to someone who had just crossed from being uninformed to being directly involved. He explained that there had been multiple withdrawals, structured transfers, and even signed documents authorizing the liquidation of certain assets tied to my identity, all processed within a short period of time, all appearing legitimate on the surface, but inconsistent with my historical behavior. He mentioned signatures, verification steps, digital confirmations, all the layers designed to make something look real when it wasn't. And as he spoke, I could see it unfolding in my mind with unsettling clarity, not as a series of random actions, but as a coordinated effort, something planned carefully, executed patiently, and hidden behind the one thing people rarely question: family. I lowered my gaze slightly, aware that the receptionist was still nearby, pretending not to listen while standing just close enough to hear every word, and I chose mine carefully, not wanting to reveal too much too soon, not wanting to give away the fact that I already knew where this was leading. "Can you tell me," I asked, maintaining that same controlled tone, "who authorized those transactions?" Another pause followed, longer this time, and I could almost feel the weight of what he was about to say before he said it. "The authorization appears to have been granted by someone with full legal access to your accounts," he replied, each word measured, deliberate. "Someone listed as your primary contact and financial proxy." And in that moment, I didn't need him to say the name, because there was only one person it could be: my son. But what settled inside me wasn't anger, not yet, not even betrayal in its loudest form, but something far more dangerous. Clarity without emotion, the kind that allows you to see things exactly as they are, without excuses, without denial, without the need to soften the truth. Because if he had done this, if he had taken control of my life, my finances, my decisions, all without my knowledge, then placing me in that nursing home hadn't been about care. It had been about control. And now, for the first time, I understood why he needed me there. Out of the way. I didn't confront the detective with everything I was thinking, not because I didn't want answers, but because I understood in that exact moment that speaking too much too soon could ruin something much bigger than a simple explanation. So instead, I remained composed, allowing my silence to work in my favor, choosing my words with precision rather than emotion. I asked a few controlled questions, enough to confirm the details without exposing my suspicion, enough to understand the timeline without revealing that I already knew who was behind it. The detective, on the other hand, seemed to recognize that I wasn't reacting like someone who had just been shocked by unexpected news, and that alone shifted the tone of the conversation into something more serious, more aligned, as if we had both silently agreed that this was no longer just an inquiry. It was the beginning of something that needed to be handled carefully. He explained that the investigation was still in its early stages, but the patterns were clear enough to justify concern, and that, under normal circumstances, they would have already contacted the person listed as responsible for the transactions. However, something about the situation had raised a red flag, something in the way the authorizations were executed, something in the speed at which decisions had been made, something in the sudden relocation of the account holder, that made them pause before moving forward. And when he said that, I understood immediately what he meant. My sudden move to the nursing home hadn't just been a personal decision. It had been part of the structure, a strategic removal, a way to reduce my presence, my access, my ability to question anything while everything was being finalized behind the scenes. I thanked him calmly, as if this were just another conversation, and before ending the call, I made one thing very clear without saying it directly. I told him I would be available for anything he needed, that I was cooperative, that I wanted to understand what was happening, but what I didn't say, what I allowed him to infer, was far more important. I was not aligned with the person who had acted in my name. When I placed the receiver back on the desk, I noticed the receptionist watching me more closely now. Her expression carefully neutral, but her curiosity impossible to hide, and I gave her nothing. No reaction. No visible concern. Just a quiet nod, as if everything was normal. Because from that moment on, everything had changed. I walked back to my room with the same slow, controlled steps, but my mind was no longer observing passively. It was calculating, connecting, reconstructing every detail I had ignored until now. The rushed decision, the lack of explanation, the expensive facility, the absence of visits, the silence from my son. It all fit together now with a precision that left no space for coincidence. He hadn't just placed me there. He had positioned me there. And that meant one thing above all else. He believed I would remain exactly as he left me. Quiet, passive, unaware. And that was his first mistake. Because I wasn't any of those things anymore. Not after that call. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since arriving. I stopped behaving like a resident, and started behaving like someone who was temporarily placed inside a system she did not belong to. The difference may seem small to anyone watching from the outside, but internally it changed everything. I adjusted the way I walked, the way I looked at people, the way I allowed conversations to unfold around me without interrupting, without drawing attention, because I understood now that information was already there. Hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. And patience had always been one of the few things life had taught me well. I began with the simplest observations, the kind that most people ignore because they seem irrelevant at first glance. The schedule of the staff, the times when certain offices were occupied or left unattended, the rhythm of movement in the building, the patterns of interaction between employees and residents. I noticed which doors remained locked during the day and which ones opened quietly when no one was looking. I paid attention to who avoided eye contact and who watched too closely, and slowly, without forcing anything, I started to map the environment around me, not physically but behaviorally. Because systems like that, no matter how controlled they appear, always reveal themselves through repetition. Later, during the early evening, I positioned myself near the administrative corridor again, this time not pretending to pass by, but simply sitting nearby, as if resting, allowing myself to blend into the background while keeping my attention sharp. It didn't take long before I saw something that confirmed what I had been feeling since the beginning. One of the administrators entered the office with a folder marked with a color I hadn't seen before, something distinct enough to stand out among the usual paperwork, and when she placed it on the desk, I caught a brief glimpse of the name printed on the top page. Name. I didn't react. Not a single movement. Not a shift in posture. But inside, everything locked into place. Because that folder shouldn't have been there. Not unless there was more being handled about me than I had been told. Waited. Not minutes, but long enough for the rhythm of the place to settle again. Long enough for the administrator to leave the office. Long enough for the hallway to return to that quiet, controlled normality that hides everything important. And then, slowly, naturally, as if I had every right to be there, I stood up and walked toward the door, my steps measured, my expression neutral, my presence unremarkable. I placed my hand on the door. And for the first time since arriving, I didn't wait for permission. The door didn't make a sound when I pushed it open, which told me more than I expected. It wasn't locked, which meant access wasn't restricted the way it should have been, which meant either negligence or confidence. Confidence that no one inside that building would dare to step beyond the invisible line that separated residents from decisions made about them. I stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind me with the same care, allowing my eyes a moment to adjust not to the light, but to the details. The desk, the folders, the computer screen still on, the faint smell of paper and something clinical, organized, controlled. This wasn't just an office. This was where things were decided. Where lives were processed. I approached the desk without rushing, every movement deliberate, every second measured, because I knew I didn't have much time, but I also knew that panic would only make me careless. The folder was exactly where I had seen it, placed neatly among others, but still distinct enough to be recognized instantly. My name was printed clearly on the tab, not handwritten, not temporary. Printed, finalized, as if whatever was inside had already been processed and approved. I opened it carefully, aware that sometimes the truth doesn't come all at once, but in pieces that require you to remain steady while everything inside you tries to react. The first page was administrative, structured, formal language, nothing unusual at first glance, but as my eyes moved down the document, something began to stand out. Authorizations, signatures, dates. All aligned, all consistent, all appearing legitimate. But I knew my own handwriting. I knew the way I signed my name, the pressure of the pen, the slight curve in the final letter, the way years of repetition leave a mark that cannot be perfectly replicated. And what I saw in front of me was not mine. It was close. Close enough to pass. But not mine. I turned the page slowly, and that's when the structure revealed itself completely. Not just one document, but a sequence of them, all connected, all building on each other, forming a chain of authority that transferred control step by step, legally, cleanly, efficiently, from me to someone else. Financial access, property management, medical decision-making. Every layer of my autonomy had been signed away, piece by piece, under my name, without me ever being present. And at the center of it all, listed clearly, without hesitation, without disguise, was my son. I didn't feel shock. Not in the way people expect. There was no sudden gasp, no trembling hands, no immediate reaction. Because by the time you see something like that clearly, the betrayal has already happened long before the moment of discovery. What I felt instead was something far more controlled. Understanding. And something else rising slowly beneath it. Precision. Because now, it wasn't a question of what had been done. It was a question of what I was going to do next. I didn't rush to flip through the rest of the folder because I understood that moments like that are not about speed, but about control, about absorbing each detail with enough clarity that nothing can be misunderstood later, especially when the truth is already trying to disguise itself as something legitimate. So instead, I allowed my eyes to move slowly across each page, reading not just the words, but the structure behind them, the intention hidden in the sequencing, The careful layering of documents that were designed to make everything appear lawful, organized, and beyond question. It was meticulous, almost impressively so, the kind of execution that doesn't come from impulse, but from planning, from someone who either knew exactly what they were doing, or had help from someone who did. The dates told a story of their own, one that didn't align with anything I had experienced personally, because while I had been living my normal life, unaware of any changes, these documents showed a parallel reality unfolding quietly behind the scenes, decisions being made, authorizations being granted, assets being repositioned, all under my name, all without my knowledge. And the timing of it all, compressed, accelerated, almost urgent, revealed something even more important. This wasn't just about gaining control, it was about securing it before I had any chance to notice. Before I could ask questions. Before I could interfere. I paused for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was recalibrating, adjusting my perspective from someone who had just discovered a betrayal to someone who now needed to understand the full extent of it. Because what I was looking at wasn't just a series of forged signatures or unauthorized transactions, it was a system built around my absence, a structure that depended entirely on me being removed, isolated, and perceived as incapable of challenging anything that had been done. The nursing home wasn't the result of what he had done. It was the condition that made everything else possible. I closed the folder carefully, placing it exactly as I had found it, not out of respect but out of strategy, because the moment anything appeared out of place, the moment someone sensed that I had seen what I wasn't supposed to see, the entire dynamic would shift, and I would lose the one advantage I had just gained, being underestimated. I stepped back from the desk, allowing my breathing to remain steady, my expression neutral, my presence invisible once again, and I took one last look at the room, not as someone leaving, but as someone who had just learned how the game was being played. Because now I understood something with absolute clarity. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had planned for me to never find out. And that was exactly why I was going to let him believe I still hadn't. When I stepped out of that office, nothing about me had changed on the outside, and that was intentional, because the moment you allow the truth to alter your behavior too quickly, you expose the fact that you've discovered something you were never supposed to see. So I walked the same way I had walked before, slowly, quietly, with that same controlled rhythm of someone who had already accepted her place there, someone who had no urgency, no resistance, no questions left to ask. I passed by the reception desk without stopping, offered a small, polite nod that meant nothing and everything at the same time, and returned to my room as if the day had unfolded exactly as expected. But inside, everything had shifted into alignment. I sat by the window again, looking out at the garden, watching the same movements, the same patterns, the same illusion of calm that had surrounded me since the moment I arrived, but now I could see through it, not because anything had changed externally, but because I had. Every detail carried a different weight now. Every interaction held a second layer. Every silence was no longer empty, but filled with meaning. And as I sat there, I began to do something I hadn't needed to do in years. I started to reconstruct a timeline, not based on what I had been told, but based on what I now knew to be true. The documents, the transactions, the sudden relocation, the absence of visits, the controlled environment. It all pointed in one direction, but there was still something missing, something that didn't fully align yet, because if my son had gone through all of that effort, if he had orchestrated something so structured, so deliberate, then there had to be a reason beyond simple greed. People don't build systems like that for small gains. They build them when there's something significant at stake, something worth the risk, something worth removing a person from their own life entirely. And that's when a thought crossed my mind that I hadn't allowed myself to consider until that moment. Not because it was impossible, but because it changed everything. What if this wasn't finished yet? What if what he had already done was only the beginning? I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of that realization settle into something solid, something that required action, not reaction, and I walked toward the small desk in my room where a telephone sat quietly, unused since I arrived. I looked at it for a moment, not hesitating, but choosing carefully, because the next step couldn't be emotional, it couldn't be impulsive, and it couldn't be obvious. It had to be precise. Because if he believed I was still unaware, then I had time. And time, used correctly, changes everything. I didn't pick up the phone immediately because urgency is the enemy of precision, and I had already seen enough to understand that whatever had been done to me was executed with patience, calculation, and control, which meant that responding emotionally would only place me at a disadvantage I could no longer afford. Instead, I sat down slowly, resting my hands on the surface of the desk, allowing my breathing to settle into a steady rhythm while my mind organized everything I had gathered so far into something actionable, something that could be used not just to understand what had happened, but to dismantle it piece by piece without alerting the person who believed he had already secured his position. The first decision I made was simple but critical. I would not contact my son. Not yet. Confrontation at that stage would only force him into defense, and someone who had planned this much in advance would not react impulsively. He would adjust, adapt, cover his tracks, and possibly accelerate whatever he still intended to do. No, this required something else entirely. It required allowing him to continue believing that everything was still under his control, that I remained exactly where he had placed me, quiet, passive, unaware. Because the moment he felt safe, he would become predictable. And predictability is where control begins to shift. I picked up the phone not to call him, but to call the one person who now represented something far more valuable than answers. Structure. The detective. Not because I trusted him blindly, but because I understood the role he played in the situation. He wasn't emotionally involved. He wasn't part of the family dynamic. He didn't carry history, guilt, or attachment. He dealt in facts, patterns, and proof. And right now, proof was the only thing that mattered. When he answered, I didn't waste words. I confirmed my identity, acknowledged our previous conversation, and then, carefully, without revealing how much I had already discovered, I asked what the next steps would be if unauthorized activity was confirmed. There was a pause on the line, not hesitation, but evaluation, as if he was measuring how much I understood without me explicitly stating it. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, becoming more direct, more aligned with mine. He explained that the process would involve verification, documentation, and eventually confrontation, but only when there was enough evidence to ensure that nothing could be denied or dismissed. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Because I wasn't interested in suspicion. I was interested in certainty. I ended the call calmly, placing the phone back in its place, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible pause. Not of relief, but of recognition. The position had changed. I was no longer reacting to something that had been done to me. I was now inside the structure of it, understanding it, moving through it without being seen. And somewhere out there, my son was still living his life, believing that everything was already finished, that there was nothing left for me to discover, that I had already been removed from the equation. And that was his second mistake. From that moment on, every action I took had a purpose, even the ones that appeared insignificant on the surface, because I understood that in situations like this, it's not the obvious moves that create impact, but the quiet ones that go unnoticed until it's too late to undo them. I resumed my routine exactly as expected, attending meals at the same time, walking through the same hallways, offering the same polite nods to the same people, because maintaining that image of normalcy wasn't just about avoiding suspicion. It was about reinforcing it, about making everyone around me more comfortable in their assumptions, more confident that nothing had changed, that I remained exactly where I had been placed. But while everything on the outside remained consistent, internally I was building something else entirely, something structured, deliberate, and far more dangerous than anything my son had anticipated. I began documenting everything, not on paper that could be found, but in memory, organizing timelines, linking events, identifying patterns that connected the financial movements to my relocation, the forged documents to the environment that kept me isolated, the absence of visits to the false narrative that I had been placed there for care. Every detail had a place now, every inconsistency had meaning, and slowly, What once looked like separate pieces became a complete picture that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. That afternoon, I made another decision that would shift everything again. Not a confrontation, not a call, but something far more subtle. I asked one of the staff members casually, as if it were just a simple question, whether there was a way for residents to review their own documentation, their admission records, their financial agreements, anything related to their stay. I phrased it in a way that sounded harmless, almost naive, like someone trying to understand how things worked rather than someone already aware that something was wrong. The staff member hesitated, just slightly, before responding, and that hesitation told me more than her answer ever could. "There are procedures for that," she said carefully, "but usually those matters are handled by the family or the assigned representative." Assigned representative. The words settled heavily, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed something crucial. Everything had been redirected away from me by design. Access, authority, information, all filtered through the same point of control. "My son." I smiled lightly, as if the answer satisfied me, thanked her, and let the conversation end there, because pushing further in that moment would have broken the illusion I was carefully maintaining. But inside, the structure became even clearer. Not only had he taken control, he had positioned himself as the only bridge between me and everything that belonged to me. And that meant one thing above all else. If I wanted to dismantle what he had built, I couldn't go through him. I had to go around him. And now, for the first time since this began, I knew exactly where to start. The next step wasn't loud, and that was exactly why it mattered, because real shifts don't announce themselves. They begin quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the structure they are targeting starts to weaken from within. That morning, instead of following the usual rhythm of waiting, observing, and adapting, I introduced something new into the pattern. Initiative, carefully measured, deliberately understated. I approached the reception desk not as someone demanding answers, but as someone requesting something simple, almost administrative, something that wouldn't raise suspicion if handled correctly. I asked about external appointments, about whether residents were allowed to leave the facility under certain conditions, framing it as a matter of routine care, of wanting to maintain some sense of independence rather than reclaim control. The receptionist responded with the same controlled politeness I had come to recognize, explaining that such requests were typically processed through the designated family contact, that approvals were needed, that transportation had to be arranged, all the standard barriers that had already been quietly placed between me and the outside world. But I didn't challenge her. I didn't question the system directly. Instead, I nodded, listened, and allowed her to believe that I accepted the explanation without resistance, because resistance would have triggered attention, and attention was something I was carefully avoiding. The goal wasn't to break the system immediately. It was to find where it could be bent. Later that day, I returned to the same desk, but this time with a slightly different approach, one that required less permission and more presence. I asked if there was a scheduled visit from any external professionals. A therapist, a consultant, anyone who wasn't directly tied to the internal administration. And when she mentioned that a visiting social worker would be arriving the following afternoon, I simply acknowledged it, thanked her, and walked away. I didn't show interest beyond what seemed appropriate. I didn't ask for details. But internally, everything aligned instantly. Because external professionals operate under a different structure. They don't rely on internal narratives. They ask questions. They document independently. And more importantly, they are not controlled by family members. That night, as I sat by the window once again, watching the same quiet garden that had once felt like a place of resignation, I understood that the environment around me had not changed, but my position within it had. I was no longer confined by the rules that had been designed to contain me, because I had identified the gaps between those rules, the spaces where control weakens and access becomes possible again. And all I needed now was the right moment to step through one of those gaps without anyone realizing I had done it. The social worker would arrive the next day. And for the first time since I had been brought there, someone from the outside was about to look in. The following afternoon arrived without urgency, But I was ready long before it did, not in appearance, because externally I maintained the same calm, the same routine, the same quiet acceptance that everyone around me had grown comfortable with, but internally, every detail had already been positioned with intention, every word I would say had been considered, every reaction measured in advance, because I understood that this interaction could not feel like an accusation, it could not sound like a desperate attempt to prove something. It had to unfold naturally, almost effortlessly, as if the truth were revealing itself on its own rather than being forced into the light. When the social worker finally entered the common area, she didn't look at anyone immediately, not in the way staff members usually do, scanning faces with familiarity or routine recognition, but with a different kind of attention, one that was observant without being intrusive, present without being predictable, and I recognized it instantly. Not because I had seen her before, but because I understood the type. She wasn't there to maintain the system. She was there to evaluate it. I didn't approach her right away. That would have been too direct, too obvious, and it would have disrupted the balance I had carefully maintained up to that point. Instead, I allowed the moment to unfold naturally, letting her move through the room, speak to others, gather her own impressions, because people like her trust what they observe more than what they are told. And then, when the opportunity presented itself, subtle, almost incidental, I positioned myself within her field of attention, not calling her, not interrupting, simply existing in a way that invited observation rather than demanded it. It didn't take long. She noticed me. Not because I did anything unusual, but because I didn't. Because while others spoke, complained, or engaged with her directly, I remained composed, quiet, attentive, and that contrast alone was enough to draw her focus. She approached me with a calm, professional tone, introduced herself, and asked if I was adjusting well, if everything was as expected, the standard questions that often receive standard answers. And for a brief moment, I allowed that expectation to exist, before gently shifting it. "I'm comfortable," I said, my voice steady, controlled. "But I don't fully understand how I got here." That was enough. Not an accusation. Not a complaint. Just a gap. And people trained to observe don't ignore gaps. She paused, not dramatically, not in a way that would alert anyone around us, but just enough to signal that something in my response didn't align with the environment she was standing in. Her posture adjusted slightly, her attention sharpened, and when she spoke again, her tone changed. Not in volume, but in intention. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. And in that moment, everything I had prepared, everything I had held back, everything I had chosen not to say until now, found its opening. Because for the first time since this began, someone was actually listening. I didn't answer her question immediately, not because I was unsure of what to say, but because I understood that the way I said it would determine how seriously it would be taken. And in situations like that, the difference between sounding confused and sounding aware is everything. So instead of rushing, I allowed a small pause to exist, just long enough to create weight, just long enough for her to remain fully present in the moment, before I spoke again, calmly, clearly, without emotion leading the words. "I mean that I was brought here quickly," I said, maintaining eye contact without intensity. "And since then, I haven't been given access to any of my own information, financial, medical, or otherwise. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't mention my son. I simply described the absence of something that should have been there." She listened without interrupting, which told me everything I needed to know about her level of attention. And when I finished, she didn't respond immediately either, which meant she wasn't dismissing it, she was processing it. That silence between us was not empty. It was evaluative, deliberate, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I felt the presence of someone who wasn't reacting emotionally, but thinking structurally, just as I was. "Do you know who is currently listed as your legal representative?" she asked, her voice still neutral, but now carrying a level of focus that hadn't been there before. "I was not informed," I replied, keeping the same tone, the same controlled delivery, even though both of us already understood where that answer was leading. She nodded slightly, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement, and then she did something subtle but significant. She shifted her body just enough to block the direct line of sight from the reception desk, creating a small, almost invisible layer of privacy between us, as if instinctively recognizing that whatever was being discussed should not be openly observed. That single movement told me more than any reassurance could have. "Would you be willing to review your documentation with me?" she asked. That was the moment the structure began to crack. Because the system that had been built around me depended on one condition above all others: that I remained separated from my own information. And now that condition was no longer holding. I didn't show relief. I didn't show urgency. I simply nodded slowly, as if this were just another procedural step, just another part of the process, even though internally, I knew exactly what this meant. Access, verification, independent review. Everything that had been redirected away from me was now finding its way back, through someone who wasn't part of the structure that had been controlling it. She made a note on her tablet, brief, precise, and then looked back at me one last time before stepping away. Her expression unchanged, her professionalism intact, but her attention now fully engaged. And as she walked toward the administrative office, the same one I had entered alone not long before, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer hidden. This was no longer contained. And somewhere, without realizing it yet, my son's control had just been interrupted. I didn't follow her, not with my eyes, not with my body, not with anything that could suggest I was invested in what was about to happen, because the strength of everything I had built until that moment depended on one thing: remaining exactly as I had appeared from the beginning. So I stayed where I was, seated, composed, allowing my posture to reflect nothing more than quiet patience, even as I became acutely aware of every movement happening just beyond my direct line of sight. The administrative door opened, then closed again, and although I couldn't hear what was being said inside, I didn't need to, because systems like that don't react loudly when they're first challenged. They react subtly, through hesitation, through changes in tone, through the kind of silence that carries more tension than any argument ever could. Minutes passed, but they didn't feel like minutes. They felt like a shift, like something internal to that building had just been disturbed in a way it wasn't prepared for, and I could sense it in the atmosphere alone. The staff moving slightly more carefully, the conversations becoming shorter, the glances more controlled, as if something had just been introduced into their environment that required attention, but not yet exposure. And that was exactly what this was. Not exposure. Not yet. This was disruption. When the door finally opened again, the social worker stepped out with the same composed expression she had carried when she entered, but there was something different now. Not visible to someone who wasn't looking closely, but unmistakable to me. Her pace had changed, her movements slightly more deliberate, her focus sharper, as if she had just confirmed something that required action, but not immediate confrontation. She didn't look at me right away. She didn't acknowledge me at all, in fact, and that alone told me everything. Because if nothing had been wrong, she would have dismissed it. But she didn't. She walked past the reception desk, exchanged a few quiet words with one of the staff members, too low to hear, but structured enough to carry authority, and then continued down the hallway without breaking her rhythm, without creating a scene, without signaling anything outwardly unusual. To anyone else it was just another routine visit. But it wasn't, because routine doesn't change the energy of a place. And this had. I remained seated for a few moments longer, not because I needed to, but because leaving too soon would have connected me to what had just happened, and connection was the one thing I was still carefully avoiding. When I finally stood up, I moved with the same calm precision as before, returning to my room without interruption, closing the door behind me, and allowing the silence of the space to settle around me once again. And then, for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to think one step ahead. Because now, it wasn't just about what had been done to me. It was about what was about to happen to him. And something told me it wasn't going to be quiet. The next morning didn't feel the same, even though everything around me tried to pretend that it was, because when a structure begins to fracture, it doesn't collapse immediately. It resists, it adjusts, it attempts to stabilize itself before the damage becomes visible, and that resistance was now present in every detail of that place. The staff moved with a slightly sharper awareness, conversations were shorter, more controlled, and there was a subtle shift in how they interacted with me, not openly different, not enough for anyone to question directly, but enough for me to recognize that something had already reached them, something had been communicated, something had changed. I followed my routine as usual, maintaining the same calm presence, the same quiet rhythm that had allowed me to move unnoticed until now, but internally I was no longer observing for information. I was observing for reaction. Because once a system is challenged, it reveals itself not through what it shows, but through what it tries to hide, and that morning there was more being hidden than before. A file that had been left on a desk the previous day was no longer there. The administrative door remained closed for longer periods. And when I passed by the reception desk, I noticed something subtle but critical, a new level of attention being placed on movement, on who went where, on who spoke to whom. They were tightening control, which meant only one thing. They knew something was wrong. Later that afternoon, as I returned to my room, I found something that hadn't been there before. Not placed openly, not left in a way that invited attention, but positioned just enough to be noticed by someone who was paying close attention. A small envelope resting on the desk near the window, plain, unmarked, with no name written on it, no indication of where it came from, no official stamp or label. It didn't belong to the routine of that place, which meant it belonged to the disruption. I closed the door behind me before approaching it, not out of fear but out of control, because moments like that require space, require silence, require the absence of interruption. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of it, light but deliberate, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to consider the possibilities, not out of uncertainty but out of awareness. This wasn't random. Nothing about this had been random since the moment the police called. I opened it carefully. Inside there was no letter, no explanation, just a single folded document. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes moving across the page, and within seconds, I understood exactly what I was looking at. Not because it was complicated, but because it was precise. It was a copy. One of the authorizations. The same structure. The same format. The same signature. But this time, there was something different. A detail that had been overlooked. A discrepancy small enough to pass unnoticed, but big enough to destroy everything. And in that moment I realized something with absolute certainty. This wasn't just evidence. This was leverage. And someone, somewhere, had just chosen a side. I didn't sit down immediately after reading the document, because the weight of what I was holding required more than just understanding. It required control. And control begins with how you respond in the seconds right after clarity arrives. So I remained standing, the paper still in my hands, allowing my eyes to pass over it again. Slower this time, not to confirm what I had already seen, but to understand exactly how it could be used. Because this wasn't just about proving that something was wrong anymore. This was about proving it in a way that couldn't be explained away, corrected, or hidden once it surfaced. The discrepancy was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't familiar with the patterns behind official documentation, but I had spent enough years dealing with contracts, signatures, and forms to recognize when something didn't align. The date formatting was inconsistent with the system used by the institution, the reference number didn't match the sequence of the other documents I had seen, and most importantly, the authorization timestamp showed a moment when, according to their own records, I had already been admitted into the facility, meaning that legally, I shouldn't have been able to sign anything without direct verification. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a contradiction. And contradictions don't weaken a system slowly. They break it. I folded the document carefully, placing it back into the envelope, not out of caution, but out of preservation, because now every detail mattered, every mark, every alignment, every imperfection that could later be used to reconstruct the truth in a way that couldn't be denied. I placed it inside my suitcase, not in an obvious compartment, but in a place that required intention to find, because at that point, Losing that document would mean losing more than evidence. It would mean losing the advantage I had just been given. Then I sat down. Not to rest, but to think. Because now there was a new element in the equation. Someone inside that system had risked something to get that document to me, and people don't take risks like that without a reason. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Which meant one of two things. Either someone had realized what was happening and decided to intervene, or someone was protecting themselves. Either way, it meant the structure was no longer unified. And when a system starts to fracture from within, it doesn't matter how strong it was at the beginning. It becomes vulnerable. I leaned back slightly, letting that realization settle into something more precise, more actionable, because now the situation had evolved beyond observation, beyond preparation. It had reached the point where movement had to be calculated carefully, because the next step wouldn't just expose the truth. It would force it into the open. And once that happened, there would be no way back for him. I didn't move for several minutes after that realization settled in, not because I was unsure of what to do, but because I understood that the difference between a good decision and an irreversible one often lies in the moments where nothing appears to be happening, when the mind is allowed to organize itself without interference, without urgency, without emotion distorting what is already clear. The document had changed everything, not just because it exposed a flaw, but because it revealed something far more important. The system that had been built around me was not as perfect as it appeared, and more critically, it was no longer fully controlled by the person who had created it. There were now variables he had not accounted for, movements he could not predict, and that meant for the first time since this began, he was no longer the only one operating with intention. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window not to look outside, but to create distance between myself and the desk, between myself and the evidence, because physical movement helps clarify thought when the mind is dealing with something that requires precision. From where I stood, I could see the garden again, the same controlled environment, the same carefully maintained illusion of calm, but now it felt different. Not because the place had changed, but because I was no longer inside it in the same way. I was no longer part of the structure. I was observing it from within, understanding its limits, its weaknesses, its blind spots, and most importantly, the points where it could be broken without warning. The question was no longer whether I had been manipulated. That had already been answered. The question now was how far it went, how much had been taken, how many decisions had been made in my name without my knowledge, and how deeply my son had embedded himself into a system that was never meant to protect him, but could now be used to expose him completely. Because what people like him often forget is that control built on deception requires constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, constant silence from everyone involved. And silence is never permanent. I turned back toward the desk, my eyes resting briefly on the suitcase where I had hidden the document, and I understood something with absolute clarity. Not everything needed to be revealed at once. In fact, revealing everything too early would only give him the opportunity to adapt, to deny, to shift responsibility, to create confusion where there was now clarity. No, this required sequencing. It required allowing the right pieces to surface at the right time, through the right channels, in a way that would not just expose what had been done, but make it impossible to defend. And that meant I needed to align everything. The detective, the social worker, the documentation, timeline. Each one alone was not enough. But together, they formed something that couldn't be ignored. I walked back to the desk, sat down slowly, and rested my hands in front of me, no longer reacting, no longer questioning, no longer searching for answers. 'Cause now, I was building the outcome. And somewhere, without realizing it yet, my son was walking directly toward it. That evening, I made a decision that would quietly accelerate everything, not in a way that could be seen from the outside, not in a way that would create immediate reaction, but in a way that would begin to align all the elements I had been carefully holding in place until now, because there comes a moment in situations like this where observation is no longer enough, where preparation must transition into movement, even if that movement is subtle, controlled, and almost invisible to anyone not directly involved. And that moment had arrived. I waited until the environment settled into its usual rhythm, until the hallways became quieter, until the staff reduced their presence to the minimum required to maintain appearances, because timing matters more than action when the objective is to avoid detection. Then, without drawing attention, I picked up the phone again and contacted the detective, not with urgency, not with alarm, but with clarity, with structure, with a kind of tone that signals readiness rather than confusion. I informed him carefully that I had reason to believe there were inconsistencies in the documentation associated with my case, that I had come across something that did not align with the official records, and that I was prepared to cooperate fully if a formal review were to take place. There was no surprise in his response this time, only confirmation, as if the situation had already evolved on his end as well, as if the pieces I had discovered were aligning with something he had already begun to suspect. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't request immediate explanations. Instead, he acknowledged the information and explained that this would allow them to escalate the matter properly, that a formal review could now be initiated with sufficient basis to move forward without relying solely on preliminary suspicion. And in that moment, I understood something important. The investigation was no longer theoretical. It had become procedural, which meant it would leave a trace. Record. A path that couldn't simply be erased or rewritten once it existed. After ending the call, I remained still for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because that single action had just shifted the situation into something irreversible. Up until now, everything had existed within controlled boundaries. Documents, conversations, observations. But now it had crossed into a system that operated independently of personal influence. And once something enters that level of structure, it no longer belongs to the person who tried to control it. I placed the phone back down slowly, my movements still measured, still calm, but internally the shift was complete. The pieces were no longer separate. The process had begun. And from this point forward, every step would build on the last, not based on assumption but on verification. And somewhere, at that exact moment without knowing why, something in my son's world was about to feel different. Not visible, not obvious, but enough. Because when the truth starts moving through the right channels, it doesn't ask for permission. It arrives. The next shift didn't happen inside the building, and that was exactly what made it powerful, because until that moment, everything had been contained within a controlled environment, a space where my son believed he had influence, where narratives could be shaped, access could be restricted, and reality could be managed without interference. But now, something had moved beyond those walls, into a system he could not monitor, could not adjust, could not silence, and the effect of that movement began to ripple outward in ways that were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but impossible to stop once they had begun. I noticed the first sign not through a direct message, not through a call, but through absence, an absence that hadn't existed before. My son had not visited since the day he brought me there, and that in itself had already been telling, but now there was something different about that absence. No longer felt like neglect, felt like distance. The kind of distance that appears when someone begins to sense that something is no longer under control, when intuition starts to replace certainty, when confidence starts to fracture, even if no clear evidence has surfaced yet. Because people who operate through control don't react only to facts. They react to shifts. And the shift had already begun. That afternoon, one of the staff members approached me, her tone slightly more careful than before, her posture more attentive, as if she had been instructed to observe without appearing to do so. She asked if I needed anything, if I was comfortable, if everything was as expected, the same questions I had heard before, but now delivered with a layer of awareness that hadn't been there until now. I responded the same way I always had. Calm, neutral, cooperative, because consistency was still my greatest advantage, and any deviation now would only draw unnecessary attention. But internally, I registered the change immediately. They were watching more closely, which meant information had already started to move. Later, as I returned to my room, I found something else that confirmed it. Not another document, not another hidden message, but something far simpler, far more direct. The phone rang. Not the one at the reception desk. Not the one used by staff. The one in my room. The one that had remained silent since the day I arrived. And for a brief moment I stood still, looking at it, not hesitating, but recognizing the significance of what was happening. Because calls like that don't come without a reason. I picked it up slowly, bringing it to my ear without speaking first, allowing the voice on the other end to reveal itself before I revealed anything in return. There was a pause. And then I heard it. My son. His voice was different. Not in tone, not in volume, but in something deeper, something harder to hide. Uncertainty. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked. And for the first time since this began, he was the one asking questions. I didn't answer him immediately, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood that silence at the right moment can say more than any response ever could, especially to someone who is already unsure of where they stand. I let the line breathe for a second longer than expected, long enough for him to feel the gap, long enough for his own thoughts to begin filling it, before I finally spoke, my voice calm, steady, exactly as it had always been. "I'm fine," I said, without emphasis, without accusation, without offering anything more than the bare minimum required to keep the conversation alive. There was a slight shift on the other end, almost imperceptible, but enough for me to recognize that my response hadn't reassured him the way he expected it to. People who rely on control often look for signals, tone, emotion, reaction, that confirm everything is still in place, that nothing has changed, that the structure they built is still intact. But I gave him nothing. No warmth, no distance, no indication that I had discovered anything. Just neutrality. And neutrality is difficult to read. "I was thinking about coming by," he continued, his voice carefully balanced, as if he was trying to sound casual while measuring every word. "Just to check on you, see how you're settling in." Another pause followed, but this one didn't come from me. Came from him. Because now he was waiting, not just for an answer, but for confirmation. Confirmation that I was still where he left me. I allowed the pause to exist again, not out of hesitation but out of control, because every second he spent waiting was a second where his certainty weakened just a little more. "You can come if you want," I replied, keeping the same tone, the same simplicity, offering no resistance, no invitation, no emotional anchor for him to hold on to. Just permission. That was enough. And also, not enough. Because what he needed wasn't permission. He needed reassurance. And I wasn't giving him that anymore. I'll stop by tomorrow," he said, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something subtle but unmistakable. Caution. The call ended shortly after, not abruptly, but without the usual closing words people use to soften distance, and when the line went quiet, I placed the receiver back down slowly, my expression unchanged, my posture still, my breathing steady. But inside, everything had moved forward. Because now he was coming. Not out of care. Not out of routine. But because something, somewhere, had started to feel wrong. And tomorrow, he was going to step directly into it. The next day didn't begin differently on the surface, and that was exactly how I needed it to be. Because any visible change in my behavior, any sign of anticipation or tension, would have disrupted the balance I had carefully maintained until that point, and I wasn't about to lose that advantage now, not when everything had aligned so precisely. I followed my routine as usual, moved through the same spaces, greeted the same people with the same quiet politeness, but internally there was no uncertainty left, no questions waiting to be answered, no hesitation about what was coming next. This was no longer about discovery. This was about execution. When he finally arrived, I knew before I saw him, not because anyone told me, but because the atmosphere shifted in a way that had become familiar to me over the past days. The subtle alertness in the staff, the slight increase in attention near the entrance, the quiet awareness that someone had entered the building who required observation without drawing attention. I remained seated in the common area, exactly where I had been for the past hour, positioned in a way that allowed him to see me first, not the other way around, because control, even in something as simple as who initiates eye contact, matters more than most people realize. He approached slowly, his steps measured, his expression composed in the way people try to be when they are unsure of what they are walking into. And when our eyes finally met, I didn't smile, I didn't frown, I didn't react in any way that would give him something to interpret. I simply looked at him, calm, present, unchanged on the surface. And that alone created a tension he wasn't prepared for. Because he wasn't expecting resistance. But he also wasn't expecting nothing. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice controlled, but not as steady as he wanted it to be. And I noticed the way his eyes moved briefly around the room before returning to me, scanning, measuring, assessing, as if trying to detect whether anything had shifted beyond what he could see. "Hello," I replied, just as calmly, just as simply. He sat down across from me, leaving a small distance between us, not too far, not too close, the kind of positioning people choose when they want to appear comfortable while maintaining space. And for a few seconds neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because both of us understood that whatever came next would define everything. "You seem okay," he said finally, and there it was again, that word. "Bae. Not how are you, not do you need anything, not I missed you. Just okay. Assessment, not care." "I am," I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. And this one belonged to him. Because now he was searching for something. Any sign. Any reaction. Any confirmation that the structure he built was still intact. And I gave him none. He shifted slightly in his seat, his posture adjusting, his confidence recalibrating in real time. And then he said something that revealed more than he intended, something that didn't come from preparation, but from pressure. "They've been asking questions," he said. I didn't react. Not externally. But inside. Everything confirmed itself. Because he had just said it. Without realizing it. The system had reached him. And for the first time since this began. He knew it. I didn't respond to what he had just said right away, not because I was surprised, but because I wanted him to sit in that sentence for a moment longer, to feel the weight of his own words without interruption, without being guided out of it. Because sometimes the most effective way to reveal truth is to let someone hear themselves clearly. I maintained the same posture, the same calm expression, my hands resting lightly in front of me, my gaze steady but not confrontational, allowing him to remain the one who had stepped forward, the one who had introduced the shift into the conversation without fully understanding the consequences of doing so. "Who's asking questions?" I said finally, my voice even, controlled, without urgency, as if the answer didn't matter as much as the act of asking itself, as if I were simply following his lead rather than challenging it. But the moment the words left my mouth, I saw it. The hesitation, small but unmistakable, the kind that doesn't come from not knowing what to say, but from realizing too late that something has already been said that can't be taken back. His eyes moved briefly away from mine, just for a second, just enough to confirm what I already knew. "Just people," he replied, too quickly, too vaguely, and that was enough. Because vague answers are never neutral. They are defensive. I nodded slightly, as if accepting it, as if it didn't require further clarification. And that was where the real shift happened. Not in what I said next, but in what I chose not to say. I didn't press him. I didn't confront him. I didn't reveal what I had seen, what I had read, what I already understood with complete clarity. Instead, I allowed the silence to return, but this time it was different. It wasn't empty. It was directional. Because now, he was the one inside it. "You made a lot of decisions very quickly," I said after a moment, still calm, still measured, still offering nothing that could be used as direct accusation, but enough to place something in front of him that couldn't be ignored. Not an attack. A statement. His posture shifted again, more noticeably this time, his shoulders tightening slightly, his breathing just a little less controlled, and for the first time since he arrived, the balance between us had changed in a way that could no longer be hidden behind appearances. Because now he understood something he hadn't expected. I wasn't confused. I wasn't passive. And I wasn't unaware. "I was trying to help," he said, and there it was. The first defense, the first attempt to frame intention before being asked to explain action, the first move of someone who knows they are about to be questioned more deeply than they are prepared for. I nodded again, slowly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the statement as something that existed, nothing more. "I know," I said. And that was what unsettled him the most. Because agreement without emotion removes the ground people stand on. I leaned back slightly, not breaking eye contact, not increasing tension, but allowing the moment to settle into something undeniable, something that didn't need to be forced anymore, because it had already arrived on its own. "You signed for me," I said. Not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. And in that moment, everything changed. For the first time since he sat down in front of me, he didn't respond immediately, and that silence, the one that followed my words, was no longer controlled, no longer strategic, no longer something either of us was choosing to use. It was something that had taken over the space between us on its own, heavy, undeniable, impossible to navigate without consequence. His eyes remained on mine, but there was something different now, something that hadn't been there before, something that couldn't be masked by posture or tone or carefully chosen words. Exposure. Not complete, not spoken, but present. 'Cause he understood exactly what I meant. And more importantly, he understood that I knew. "That's not what it looks like," he said finally. His voice quieter now, less certain, the edges of his control beginning to blur, and that sentence, as predictable as it was, carried with it everything I needed to confirm that there was no misunderstanding left between us, no confusion, no alternative explanation waiting to be revealed. Because people who have done nothing wrong don't begin by reframing what something looks like. They begin with the truth. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't challenge the statement. I simply let it exist, just as I had done with everything else he had said so far, because I understood now that the more space I gave him, the more he would reveal on his own, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to fill the silence with something that could restore his position. "You don't understand how complicated things got," he continued, leaning forward slightly now, as if proximity could reinforce his argument, as if being closer would make his words more believable. "There were things you weren't handling, things that needed to be taken care of quickly, and You signed for me," I repeated. Same tone, same pace, same clarity. And that was where the structure he had built began to collapse in real time. Because repetition, when used correctly, removes escape. It forces the conversation back to the point that cannot be avoided. He stopped again, his mouth slightly open as if the next part of his explanation had been interrupted not by my words, but by the realization that they were no longer working, that the path he had expected to take no longer existed, that the version of me he had planned for, the one who would question, react, argue, give him something to respond to, was not sitting in front of him anymore. Instead, there was something else. Something quieter. And far more dangerous. "I had legal authority," he said, this time more firmly, as if grounding himself in the one piece of the situation he believed still protected him. Everything was processed correctly. There it was. The final layer. The justification. The belief that structure alone could shield intention. And for the first time since he arrived, I allowed something to shift. Not in my tone. Not in my posture. But in the direction of what came next. "Then you won't have a problem explaining it," I said. Precise. Final. And in that moment, he realized something he hadn't considered until now. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was the beginning of consequences. The moment those words settled between us, I could see it clearly, not in a dramatic way, not in something that would be obvious to anyone passing by, but in the small fractures that begin to appear when someone realizes that the version of reality they have been relying on is no longer holding together the way it was supposed to, because control is not something that disappears all at once. It erodes, it weakens in layers. It slips quietly until the person holding it can no longer tell where exactly it started to fail, and that was exactly where he was now, sitting across from me, still trying to maintain posture, still trying to organize his thoughts into something coherent, but already losing the structure that had allowed him to feel secure just moments before. He leaned back slightly, not in relaxation, but in recalibration, as if creating physical distance could give him the space he needed to rebuild his position, to reframe the situation into something he could manage again, something he could explain, justify, control. But the problem was no longer the explanation, it was the fact that the explanation was now irrelevant, because this was no longer a matter of perception, it was a matter of record, of documentation, of timelines that existed outside of anything he could adjust with words alone. And I could see him realizing that, slowly, painfully, in the way his eyes no longer searched for an immediate response from me, but instead began searching for something else entirely, a way out that didn't exist anymore. "You're making this sound worse than it is," he said, his voice attempting to regain firmness, but lacking the foundation it had carried before, because statements like that don't come from certainty, they come from resistance, from the need to minimize something that has already grown beyond control. I didn't interrupt him, didn't correct him, didn't challenge the wording because I didn't need to. The situation no longer depended on how it sounded. It depended on what it was. I let a brief silence follow, not long enough to feel forced, but long enough to remove any sense of urgency from the moment. And then I spoke again, not louder, not sharper, but with a level of clarity that didn't require emphasis. "There's already a record," I said, watching carefully, not for reaction, but for recognition, because this wasn't about surprising him anymore. It was about confirming what he had already begun to understand on his own. People are already looking at it. That was the moment something inside him shifted in a way he could no longer contain. Not externally, not fully, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see it clearly. Enough for me to understand that whatever sense of control he had left was no longer anchored in certainty, but in hope, and hope, when it replaces control, is a dangerous place for someone like him to be. "Who?" he asked, and this time there was no attempt to hide it, no effort to mask the question behind something else, no strategy in the way it was delivered. Just direct need. And that told me everything. Because now he wasn't trying to guide the conversation anymore. He was trying to catch up with it. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something far more distant, something that comes when understanding replaces emotion entirely. And I answered him in the same way I had answered everything else since this began. Carefully. Precisely. Without giving him more than he needed. "Enough," I said. And in that moment, he knew. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to understand that whatever was coming next was no longer something he could control. He didn't speak immediately after my answer, but this time the silence wasn't heavy because of control. It was heavy because of pressure, because the space between us had shifted completely, and he could feel it, even if he couldn't fully understand how far it had already gone beyond him. His eyes moved again, briefly scanning the room, not in curiosity, but in calculation, as if trying to identify who, what, or where the threat was coming from, as if the answer could be found in the environment instead of within the situation itself. But the truth had already moved beyond the room, beyond the building, beyond anything he could see. "You're overreacting," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction, not because he didn't want to believe them, but because he no longer did, not fully, not the way someone does when they are still in control of the narrative. It was the kind of sentence people use when they are trying to stabilize something that has already begun to collapse, when they are trying to convince both the other person and themselves at the same time, hoping that repetition might somehow rebuild what clarity has already taken apart. I didn't respond to that directly. There was no need. Arguing with denial only strengthens it, gives it structure, gives it something to push against, and I had no intention of doing that. Instead, I remained exactly as I had been, calm, composed, allowing him to continue, because at this point, every word he chose would either reveal more or weaken what little ground he had left. "I did what needed to be done," he continued, leaning forward slightly again. His voice now carrying a different tone. Not authority, not confidence, but justification, the kind that comes when someone is no longer explaining actions, but defending them. "Things were getting complicated, and you weren't. You weren't handling them. I stepped in. I took responsibility." There it was again. Responsibility. A word that sounds like protection. but can hide control when placed in the wrong hands. I let that sit for a moment, not dismissing it, not validating it, just allowing it to exist in the space between us, because I wanted him to hear himself clearly, without interruption, without correction, without guidance. And putting me here was part of that. Yes. Same tone. Same calm. But this time, direction. He hesitated. Not long. But enough. Because that question didn't require interpretation. It required truth. It was temporary, he said quickly, too quickly, as if speed could make it sound more believable, just until everything was sorted out. Temporary. Another word people use when they don't intend to return something. I nodded slightly, again not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the existence of what had been said, because by now the conversation was no longer about uncovering anything new. It was about allowing the reality to become undeniable, even to him. And the signatures. Yes, that was the shift. That was where everything tightened. Because now, there was nowhere left to move. He leaned back again, this time more noticeably, his jaw tightening slightly. His eyes no longer searching, but holding, as if bracing for something he could no longer avoid. I had authorization, he said again, but this time the words didn't land the same way. Because repetition without new substance doesn't strengthen a position, it exposes the lack of it. And for the first time since he walked in, he didn't sound like someone explaining a decision. He sounded like someone trying to survive one. The space between us had changed in a way that could no longer be disguised, not by tone, not by posture, not by carefully chosen words, because once a structure collapses internally, everything built on top of it begins to lose stability at the same time. And that was exactly what I was watching happen in front of me, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the subtle disintegration of certainty, in the way his answers no longer connected the way they were supposed to, in the way his presence itself seemed slightly misaligned with the situation he had created. He ran his hand briefly along his face, a small gesture, almost instinctive, but one that revealed more than anything he had said so far, because it wasn't a gesture of confidence. It was a gesture of pressure, the kind people make when they are trying to hold something together internally while the external structure continues to shift beyond their control. And I didn't interrupt that moment. I allowed it to happen fully because the more space he had to feel what was happening, the less control he had over how he responded to it. "You're acting like I did something criminal," he said, and this time there was something different in his voice. Not denial, not justification, but something closer to defensiveness mixed with uncertainty, as if he was no longer entirely sure where the line had been crossed, or whether it had been crossed at all. I looked at him calmly, without reacting to the word itself, because I didn't need to define anything for him anymore. "It's already being reviewed," I said. No emphasis, no explanation, just reality. That was enough. Because that sentence didn't accuse him. It didn't argue with him. It didn't even require him to respond. It simply removed the conversation from his control entirely. And that's when it happened. A shift so small that most people wouldn't notice it, but so significant that it changed everything. His eyes moved again, but this time not around the room. Not away from me, but inward. As if something had just connected. As if a realization had just finished forming. "You talked to someone," he said. Not a question. Conclusion. And in that moment he knew. Not the details. Not the extent. But enough. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I simply held his gaze, steady, unchanged, allowing the silence to answer in a way words no longer needed to. And that was when the last piece of control he had been holding on to slipped. Because now, for the first time since this began, he wasn't managing the situation anymore. He was inside it. And worse than that, he was already behind. He didn't say anything else after that, not immediately, not because he had nothing left to say, but because whatever he had been preparing internally no longer fit the situation he was now facing, and that disconnect, between what he expected and what was actually happening, was finally becoming visible in a way he could no longer control. The confidence he had arrived with hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted into something unstable, something reactive, something that depended on information he no longer had access to. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him. Before either of us could continue, the moment was interrupted. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but in a way that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. One of the staff members approached us, her posture more formal than before, her expression carefully neutral, but her tone unmistakably different. "Excuse me," she said, directing her attention toward my son, not me. "There are a few people here who need to speak with you." There was a brief pause. Not long, but long enough. "Who?" he asked, and even though he tried to keep his voice steady, the question came out sharper than intended, carrying a tension that hadn't been there when he first arrived. "They're waiting in the administrative office," she replied, not elaborating, not softening it, simply stating it as fact. That was all. No explanation. No context. Just direction. He looked at me for a moment, searching again, not for answers this time, but for confirmation of something he was no longer sure of, and I gave him the same thing I had given him from the beginning. Nothing. Not indifference. Not coldness. Just absence of reaction. Because by now, the situation no longer depended on what I said. He stood up slowly, adjusting his posture in a way that suggested he was trying to regain control before stepping into whatever was waiting for him behind that door, and for a brief second I could see it clearly. The internal shift from confidence to calculation, from certainty to anticipation, from control to exposure. He didn't say anything as he turned to follow the staff member, but he didn't need to, because everything that mattered had already been said. I remained seated exactly where I was, not watching him leave, not following with my eyes, not breaking the stillness I had maintained since the moment he arrived, because that stillness was no longer just part of my strategy. It was my position. Minutes passed, and more. And although I couldn't hear what was happening inside that office, I didn't need to, because when systems like that move into formal structure, they follow patterns that don't require visibility to be understood. Questions would be asked. Documents would be presented. Timelines would be compared. And most importantly, contradictions would surface. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to remove doubt. Enough to remove protection. Enough to remove him. And as I sat there, in the same place where he had once believed I would remain powerless, I understood something with absolute certainty. This was no longer a conversation. This was a process. And processes like that don't stop once they begin. Time moved differently after he walked into that office, not slower, not faster, but with a kind of weight that made each passing minute feel like part of something larger, something already unfolding beyond the surface of what anyone in that room could see. I remained exactly where I had been, not out of passivity, but out of certainty, because by now I understood that movement was no longer required from me, that everything that needed to be set in motion had already been placed where it needed to be, and all that remained was for the structure to follow its own course. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it carried a finality that didn't need to be announced. He stepped out differently than he had entered, not in appearance alone, but in presence, in the way his body held itself, in the way his eyes no longer searched outward, but struggled to remain steady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he hadn't been prepared for. Behind him, two individuals followed. One I recognized as the detective I had spoken to, the other someone I hadn't seen before, formal, composed, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need introduction to be understood. They didn't approach me. They didn't need to, because this was no longer about me being informed. This was about him being addressed. I watched without watching, aware of the movement, aware of the shift, but not engaging with it because at this stage, involvement was no longer necessary. The conversation that followed wasn't loud enough to draw attention, but it didn't need to be, because tension carries its own presence, and even from a distance, I could see it in the way he stood, in the way his shoulders tightened, in the way his hands no longer knew where to rest. "This is a formal matter now." I heard, not clearly, not every word, but enough. Formal. That word changes everything. Because once something becomes formal, It becomes documented. And once it is documented, cannot be undone. He tried to speak, I could see that much, tried to respond, to explain, to position himself in a way that still made sense of everything that had been uncovered, but explanations only work when they align with evidence, and evidence, once established, doesn't negotiate, doesn't adjust. It doesn't bend to intention. Simply exists. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. His gaze shifted once, briefly, and this time it did land on me, not with accusation, not with anger, but with something far more revealing. Recognition. Not of what had happened, but of what had ended. Because now he understood something that hadn't been clear to him before. This wasn't a situation he could fix. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. This wasn't something he could control anymore. This was consequence. And consequence doesn't ask permission. Arrives. He didn't come back to me after that. There were no final words. No attempt to restore anything. No closing of the distance that had once existed between us. Because some actions don't leave room for repair. They leave a record. And records don't forget. After that day, everything returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence that had surrounded me when I first arrived. No longer the kind that comes from being ignored, overlooked, or placed aside as if your presence no longer mattered, but a different kind entirely. One that comes after something has been seen clearly, after truth has moved through the right places and settled where it cannot be undone, where it no longer needs to be spoken out loud because it already exists in record, in structure, in consequence. No one explained everything to me in detail, not fully, not step by step, but I didn't need them to, because by then I understood how these things work, how systems respond once they are activated, how processes take over once evidence has been established, and how outcomes begin to shape themselves without requiring constant attention. I was asked a few questions, calmly, respectfully, not as someone being evaluated, but as someone whose position had been restored, and that alone told me everything I needed to know. The structure that had been built around me had not only been interrupted, it had been reversed. My son didn't come back. Not the next day. Not the day after. Not at all. And I didn't try to reach him. Not because I didn't have the opportunity, but because I no longer needed to, because whatever needed to be said between us had already been said in the only way that mattered. Not through words, not through emotion, not through confrontation, but through consequence, through the undeniable shift that happens when actions are no longer hidden behind intention. In the days that followed, small things began to change, not dramatically, not in ways that would draw attention, but in ways that reflected something deeper, something more meaningful. I was given access to my own information again. My documents were reviewed with me, not around me. Decisions were explained, not assumed. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't being managed. I was being respected. And that difference changes everything. One afternoon, as I sat by the same window where I had spent so many hours observing a life I thought had been taken from me, I realized something that stayed with me long after everything else had settled. Not all betrayals come with noise, not all control comes with force, and not all losses happen in ways that are immediately visible. Sometimes they arrive quietly, dressed as care, disguised as responsibility, presented as something done for your own good. And it's only when you step back, when you observe, when you allow yourself to see without reacting, that the truth begins to take shape. And when it does, you have a choice: to confront it loudly, or to dismantle it silently. Chose silence, not because I was weak, but because I understood something he didn't. That real strength doesn't need to prove itself, just waits until the truth does it for you. There are things people don't talk about enough, not because they don't happen, but because they happen quietly, behind closed doors, inside families, inside relationships where trust is assumed and rarely questioned. And by the time something feels wrong, it's often already too late for a simple explanation to fix it. What happened to me didn't begin in that nursing home, and it didn't begin with a signature or a document. It began much earlier, in small decisions, in moments where control was given little by little, in trust that was never meant to be examined closely. And that's how it happens. Not all at once, but slowly, until one day, you realize someone else is living your life for you. I could have fought differently. I could have raised my voice, created a scene, forced everything into the open from the very beginning. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid and not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because I knew that some truths, when exposed too early, are easier to deny, easier to twist, easier to bury again before they have the chance to fully exist. So I waited. I watched. Understood. And when the moment came, I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to convince anyone. I didn't need to prove anything. Because the truth, when it is placed in the right system, doesn't need defense. Carries itself. If there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's this: pay attention to what is done in your name, even when it comes from people you trust, especially when it comes from people you trust, because control doesn't always arrive as something obvious, and betrayal doesn't always look like betrayal at first. Sometimes, looks like help. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous. If this story made you think, if you've ever felt something didn't sit right but couldn't explain why, take a moment and tell me in the comments. Would you have confronted him? Or done the same thing? And if you understand stories like this, stories that reveal what people try to hide, make sure you subscribe. 'Cause some truths only appear when you're paying attention.